So the next panel is about food, which I have to say, when I was talking to Linda about what panels I was going to do, I'm really excited to do a food panel. And I'll start with a little food anecdote. I was talking to Ruth Reichel recently, who was the editor of Gourmet, the last editor of Gourmet before it was shuttered. And I was talking to her about, what's the future of food? And she said, well, do you know this thing called Soylent? Now raise your hand if you know what Soylent is. Oh, a lot of hands. So this is several months ago. She was cutting edge. I didn't know what it was. And she said, it's this terrible thing where if you don't have time to eat, you just drink the soy thing, and it apparently has all your nutrients, and this could be the end of food. And I said, I can't believe that. People love eating. And so, I mean, I think we're at this moment right now where we're thinking about high-tech food. Just heard somebody talk at MIT about growing meat and leather in labs so that, you can eat meat, but, we heard about it in the first panel, this idea of chopping down the rainforest, clear-cutting it to have cattle. But what if you're eating lab meat instead? So we're at this time, and we're also at this time where we're going back in some ways to older methods of doing something. So, a lot of people talk about what their grandmothers cook. What my grandmother, the most complicated thing I ever saw her make was Jell-O. My mom made Annie's pasta very well. And I am actually really into baking bread from scratch. So I think in some ways we also have that thing of going backwards and you see it with Alice Waters, school kids understanding what kale is and actually having these little home gardens or school gardens or whatever. So this panel is going to sort of look at different aspects of food, sustainability, how you spread things around, what our new attitudes are towards it. And I will turn it over first to John Foley, who just took the helm at the California Academy of Science, which is, of course, California being a real sort of thought leader and pioneer in thinking about green issues. He recently won the Heinz Global Environmental Prize, and he has written about this issue of food and sustainability for National Geographic. So John, over to you.
So thanks so much for having me here today. The issues about food are so important to so many different things. I just want to give kind of an overview of some of the challenges we face, and maybe a bit of an appetizer, being the first speaker in this session on food, and I'm sure there'll be many, many more, about some of the solutions we might be looking at to address some of our food challenges. But first I want to just make the point is how we think about the future of food will really have repercussions about the future of our entire planet and indeed our civilization. And that really is for three kind of very basic reasons. One, of course, is that we have the challenge of feeding the world right now. There are approximately 7 billion people on Earth today, a little north of that, about 7.2. And roughly about 1 billion or so people are what considered food insecure. That doesn't mean that there isn't enough food in the world. There certainly is. But there are 1 billion people who lack the economic and institutional and governance power to get that food. Essentially, they're too poor or too disenfranchised to get access to the food that is already grown in other parts of the world, for example. So this is a huge challenge. It has nothing to do with agronomy. It has everything to do with governance and economics and justice more than anything else. So this is one huge issue, and it's been very persistent and has never quite gone away. So that's a big problem. Incidentally, another 1 billion people in the world are becoming overweight and obese at the same time. So you could argue maybe 2 out of 7 people on the planet aren't being served all that well by our food system today. So that's one issue. Second, of course, is that, yes, while we still have 1 billion people who don't have access to food and others do, the whole system is demanding more food all the time as we become more populous and, more importantly, as people become richer around the world and consume more meat. It turns out that population growth would maybe increase food demand a little bit, but the rise of the middle class around the world, especially in China and India, and the changing patterns of diet are really even bigger than that. So the problem here is if we did nothing about population growth, and if we did nothing to change diets, and I'm not saying we should do nothing, but if we just sat back and let them unfold, we would have about a doubling of global food demand by mid-century. Of course, that's assuming we did nothing, and that's probably the worst assumption of all. We sure as heck can do something about this, and I'll get back to that later. But if we just let that train keep going, population plus dietary changes means we would need a lot more food by mid-century. So that's a real problem. The third is connecting back to the previous session, more about global environment and climate change and other things. I'm a global environmental scientist. I actually was trained as a climatologist and then moved into ecology and other things. So the reason I got interested in food is because agriculture is the biggest thing we hit this planet with, bar none. Nothing else comes close. Just look at the numbers. We cover about 40% of Earth's land surface in one thing, farms. All of that area, those green areas where we grow crops, all those brown areas are where we have animals and pastures. Those are the two largest biomes or ecosystems on the planet now, are pastures and then croplands. Third would probably be desert, and then maybe tropical forest or something like that. So this is a huge footprint in terms of biodiversity, habitats, and so on. So about 40% of all the land on Earth is in agriculture, but also most of the water we use is in agriculture too. That's an extraordinary amount of water is being used to irrigate our crops. For example, here's a picture of flying into Phoenix, looking out an airplane window, seeing the iceberg lettuce being grown in the desert, probably being shipped to places like Boston in the wintertime, because it's pretty hard to grow stuff here in the winter. It turns out that agriculture is a massive consumer of water. It's about 70% of what we call water withdrawals. That's water we pump out of a natural system and use for something. But it's 90% if you count for the return flows. Agriculture, we tend to use the water and it then evaporates or transpires into the atmosphere and it moves someplace else in the world. So it's a huge use of water. So think about that. Right now, agriculture uses 40% of all the land on Earth, 70 or 90% of all the water we consume on the planet. And also connecting back to climate change, we often think of climate change as primarily an energy problem, but that's a simplification. It turns out that agriculture is the biggest contributor to climate change of any one economic sector. It's about 35% of greenhouse gas emissions, roughly, for the last 2 decades, came from deforestation, methane from cattle and rice fields, nitrous oxide from overuse of fertilizers, and other agricultural emissions. So about 30 to 35% is tied up in growing food. The second biggest sector of the economy contributing to climate change will be every form of transportation known to humankind is 15%. So if you want to tackle climate change, you better start with food, because it's by far the biggest lever we have around the world. In the US, these numbers are different. It's considerably lower in the US, but globally, it's huge. I know a previous speaker talked about the importance of deforestation in terms of climate change, and that's absolutely right. That's a huge leverage point in battling climate change. And the good news is, I think you heard before, I wasn't here, but is that Brazil has seen about a 70 to 80% drop in its deforestation rate, which would be like taking every car in America off the road forever. That's pretty good news. We need more good news like that. So this is a big deal. Agriculture is facing 3 interwoven challenges of food security, meeting increasing demands from around the world as we get richer and more numerous, and third, making it truly sustainable. But how are we doing so far? What's been the history of agriculture for the last few decades? Well, it's been dominated by one simple narrative. How many of you remember Sarah Palin? Right? Well, how could you forget, right? Yeah. Okay. You ask Sarah Palin what her energy policy is, and it's 3 simple words. It's drill, baby, drill, right? Very simple, easy to remember, not very right, but it's, it's her policy, it's okay. I think in agriculture, we've had a similar kind of mindset. It's been more like grow, baby, grow. Let's just grow more stuff. We'll grow more stuff. And we've been calling this the Green Revolution. And in some ways, it was pretty miraculous. It did some amazing productivity gains, but in other ways, it was very disruptive to economies, social situations, and certainly the environment around the world too. So it's been a trade-off, and we could debate that later, whether it's been net good or net bad or whatever, but it's been a mixed bag. But some things that have been pretty interesting about it is that for decades, we have seen big yield increases. That is, how much we grow per acre of land. These maps show kind of global data that my lab has been putting together, showing how yields of crops have been increasing. The colors don't matter so much, except the red are places where the yields have been increasing a lot. We can zoom in, for example, for corn or maize here and see how in the Midwest and in Brazil and parts of Western Europe that the yields have been increasing a lot. You know, this has been the inputs of more fertilizers, more machines, more water, and more improved genetics have boosted the yields, at least until recently. What we're seeing lately, though, is the green revolution, especially for the crops we actually need in the world, are slowing down. The two crops that matter the most to feeding the world right now aren't corn and soybeans. They don't feed hardly anybody, actually. What really feeds the world in terms of calories are two other crops, wheat and rice. Wheat and rice provide half of the calories consumed on the planet every day. Two crops, half the calories on the planet. That's a lot. I'm not saying nutrients, I'm not saying vitamins, thiamine, protein, other stuff, but just raw calories, which does matter still. Those two feed most of the world. And it turns out that those crops are experiencing kind of a slowdown, if not total cessation, of the green revolution. Rice, which is the most important crop for calories in the world, all of those areas that are in brown and red around the world, this kind of tannish color throughout China, South Asia, West Africa, those are places where the yields of rice has been flat for at least a decade, hasn't moved at all. The red areas are actually where we've seen declines in rice yield. Perhaps due to political turmoil or lack of investment. Sometimes climate shifts have shown up in here too. Things that are beginning to show some interesting signs of declining. Really important, that's the world's most important crop. Second most important, wheat. Though it's the largest in area, it's second in calories. Every single wheat belt around the world, whether it's Australia, China, India, Western, Eastern Europe, the Pantanal region, the Great Plains, all of them have been yield stagnant for 10 years or more. This is extraordinary, and most people don't want to hear about this. It's just the agricultural sector really still pretends this isn't happening, but it is. The green revolution is essentially ending in the crops we need most, and 20 to 40% of our most important cereal crops, for example, have had stagnating yields. So the grow, baby, grow era may be ending, and maybe we need to think of some other kinds of solutions. My point here is that the old model of agriculture that we've seen, even though we think of it as new, it's been going on for about 40 years, this era of the kind of green revolution and grow, baby, grow. What we've got here is it's not really improving food security. We still have about 1 billion people who don't have the economic or institutional power to get food. Green revolution didn't address that very well. Secondly, it's not really keeping pace with demand because the yields are now plateauing for most of the most important crops. And after 2008, after the price spikes in food and volatility in commodity prices we've been seeing, that's a dubious proposition at best, that just growing more will get us where we need to be. And certainly it's not environmentally sustainable. How we practice agriculture absolutely cannot continue if you want to address climate change, habitat loss, freshwater security, or anything else of that nature. So it's a big, big problem. So we have got to think about a different way of thinking about it. And the first is maybe it's the first step of anything. And first you admit you have a problem. So maybe we have to kind of say, maybe that grow, baby, grow narrative is broken, and maybe we need a new one. And so this is something a number of people around the world have been thinking about. I've been lucky to work with a few of them, and we've written a few things about this. This is not meant to be the final list of some solutions. Here are some, though, just to maybe whet the appetite to have some more conversation about later. But these are some things I think are maybe some beginning steps in thinking about how we can have more food available to everyone, not just more crops, but more food. How do we help on the social outcomes of agriculture, empowering people and avoiding the disconnection that food security seems to still have in the world? And of course, dealing with the massive environmental challenges posed by modern agriculture, which is kind of how I got interested in this in the first place. So I'll talk about 5 things. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but maybe 5 that really are necessary, but maybe not sufficient to solve some of these problems. But let me go through them and see if they make any sense. First is to really tackle deforestation, and I'm thrilled a previous speaker talked about this before too. But the bottom line here is we're clearing still very large areas of rainforest, previously much of it in Brazil, now increasingly more in Indonesia as Brazil's reduced their rates overall. What we're doing here, though, is kind of sad, is we're clearing these huge areas that lock up carbon, are home to incredible realms of biodiversity and watersheds and other things like this. And we're not doing this to feed poor people. If we were, I'd be out there with a chainsaw myself. But we're not. We're out there basically producing middle-class convenience foods. Beef, soybeans for pigs in China, palm oil, and timber. Those are the 4 biggest commodities that drive deforestation around the world right now. This is not feeding the bottom of the base of the pyramid of the poorest people in the world. It's feeding people like you and me. And we're trading rainforests for it. That's not even necessary, and it's just pretty dumb. We can do better than that. Maybe we could do something else. Instead of tearing down rainforest to feed us, maybe we could help poor farmers in places that have already got farms to do a little bit better, empowering their lives, helping them out economically in their own food security and their economic security, but also maybe put more food in the world's markets that could help them economically, but also relieve pressure on global commodities and food prices. That might be a bad thing. So grow more food with poor farmers leading the way, not just rich farmers, on existing land. And you can do the analysis. This is the science behind it. This is kind of showing the regions of the world in the kind of yellows and red colors, places where you might be able to get much more yield because these places have relatively low yield for their climate and their soil conditions. So we know there are lots of parts of Africa and Central America, even Eastern Europe. During the Soviet era, Eastern Europe had about half the yields they should be having compared to their Western European counterparts. These are some of the richest soils in the world, actually, in this part of the world. Now they're at about 20%. Soviet farming was bad, and then it got worse post-Soviet era because nobody even knew who owned the land. What the institutions they had were gone. So there's huge areas of the world where the soils are good, the climate is good, but the institutions and the governance and the money aren't there. These are some of them. Now, a lot of folks are going in and say, well, this is where we need GMOs and high-tech agriculture. And I'm like, no, you don't. You need manure and water. You know, don't give me that. You can't grow a GMO on soils that doesn't have nitrogen in it or phosphorus or something. And this is where very low-tech solutions for simple methods of maybe irrigation, maybe mixed livestock grazing crop systems, things like this that are much more suitable to smallholders, women farmers mostly in these parts of the world too, who really need just a little bit of help of maybe lending credit or access to markets or some technical assistance, not being taken over by large corporate farming systems. That's a debate we should have, but I think we can do this with a low-tech approach, which would be far better socially and actually far better environmentally and would work better, frankly, agronomically. So that's something I think could be done a lot, but the trick is, of course, how to actually pull that off. And that's something that would still bedevils us to this day about how we can really design development programs that work for people on the ground. But we'll have to figure that one out too. Another thing we have to figure out, but fortunately there's a lot of room to get better at this, is thinking about how to do more nutritional delivery from agriculture. You know, really give people food and use far less water and much less chemical inputs in the process. Just think about what we do. We have some absurdly inefficient ways of delivering food right now. This thing right here, this is meant to be an irrigation machine, right? It's supposed to be irrigating crops. I look at that and I say, that's an evaporation machine. You know, I've asked my students over the years, could you ever design a machine that is better at wasting water than that? And so far, no. In 8 years of asking that question, nobody's been able to. I'm like, oh yeah, you put it in little tiny droplets aiming at exactly 45-degree angle to get the maximum trajectory across during the daytime on a hot summer. I'm like, what? You know, you don't want to put it down there. And that's, of course, what the Israelis do. And other countries are beginning to shift towards drip irrigation. You put the water in the roots. You put a little more capital in, but you save maybe 10-fold, sometimes 100-fold, how many liters of water it takes to make one more food calorie. So there are huge differences between the best irrigation systems in the world and the worst. The Israelis probably have the best. The US is sort of in the middle, and India and Pakistan, two nuclear-armed nations who've gone to war before, who are having diminishing water reserves, are the worst in terms of converting water to food right now. And India alone uses half of the irrigation water on the planet right now as one country. Everybody else in the world is the other half. So we have a lot of work to do in that. Same thing with chemicals. We use nitrogen and phosphorus and other things. We often put them on in inappropriate times for the environment, but it's when the farmer has time. I used to live in the Midwest, and farmers would often put on fertilizers and manure in the fall because they had the time to do it then. Their labor was available, but after the snow melted in the spring, much of that stuff was just washed off into our streams and rivers and lakes. So it's a big problem. Okay. What we also have to do is to think about how we use the food we actually grow. That's a big issue, and this gets very controversial very fast, so it'll be fun to talk about. Well, we have to rethink our diets and biofuels as well as food waste. The thing that's really startling about this is we live in two totally different worlds when it comes to food. We live in the green world that feeds people. China, India, Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean countries, California through Latin America down through the Andes. These are the places where all the crops that are being grown are fed directly to people. Fruits, vegetables, roots and tubers, cereals, things like that. The red places, like Western Europe, but especially our corn and soybean belt, feed animals and increasingly cars. I used to live in Minnesota until recently, and 87% of all the crops grown in Minnesota never ended up on a human plate. They went to animals, or increasingly as ethanol production. Now, we do eat the animals, but they're very limited in the efficiency. About 10% on average. Beef is about 3% efficiency of taking 100 calories of corn will turn into about 3 calories of boneless beef at the end. So just do the math. So it turns out that by changing the way we think about our diets, only about 60%, like 59% of all the calories grown in the world end up on a human plate. And that's because of the inefficiencies of diets using meat and dairy-based diets, plus biofuels are increasing in this. So I'm not a vegetarian yet. I probably should be, but my wife would not be very happy with me if I did that. So people ask, are you vegetarian? I'm like, no, I'm married. So we have to negotiate these things sometimes, So I eat less meat, but but the other thing we can do, maybe we'll have some disagreements about diets for a while, and that's a good discussion to have, but we could all do better. But the one thing, and I've never met anybody from the pro-food waste lobby yet, hope they're not here today, but it turns out about 30 to 40% of all the food in the world, whether it's plant or animal-based, is wasted and just not eaten by anybody. That's in rich countries because we consumers throw it out or around our supermarkets and restaurants. But in poor countries, it's about the same number, but it's lost near the farmer and it never got into the marketplace. Okay, well, I have to wrap up now. So what I want to just leave you with is the final message here that, we can feed the world and sustain the planet. It turns out we have all the tools we need to do that, but it's going to require the hardest thing of all, not just changing agricultural practices, but changing the way we think. And we've got to change two things. We have to go from grow, baby, grow to a different bumper sticker. Produce more with less. And also use what you have better. So I'll stop there and look forward to discussions on the panel. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. That was great. I have a bunch of questions already for you. We're now going to turn it over to a husband and wife team. That was the marriage handoff right there. Haile Johnston and Tatiana Garcia-Granados. And they both graduated from the Wharton School at UPenn, and they've sort of taken the knowledge that they got and taken that sort of inclination to innovate and co-founded this system to provide healthy food to people living in the inner city, food that they might not normally get access to. Take it away.
Thank you. So I actually was a vegetarian before we got married. So. Again, my name is Haile Johnston, and this is my wife, Tatiana Garcia-Granados, and we are the co-founders and co-directors of the Common Market in Philadelphia. And before we talk a little bit, we wanted to share a short film that tells a little bit of our story. So, thank you.
Thank you very much for being here. It's great to be in Philadelphia with you to talk about what it's going to take to create a food system that's healthy and sustainable for all. We will never know which innovation, which model, which new policy is the one that finally brings this food system to a tipping point for change. But it will happen. The time is now.
Welcome to our community of Strawberry Mansion. My wife Tatiana and I moved here looking for a home and a community where we could raise our family. And This was, in many ways, the place where the Common Market was born.
The Common Market was started on a very simple premise, that everybody deserves to eat good food and that the people who grew the food deserve to be paid fairly.
Strawberry Mansion is a community rich in African-American culture and history, beautiful neighborhood next to the park with historic architecture. Yet unfortunately, it has some of the highest rates of chronic disease and diet-related disease in the country. When you go to some of these corner stores in our community, you might find 10 different kinds of potato chips, but rarely will you find any whole vegetables.
We started trying to set up a farmer's market in our community. And as we did more research, we realized that it wasn't just neighborhoods like ours.
It was the hospitals, it was the universities, it was the public and private schools, elder care facilities, and institutions in our region
That wanted access to this fresh, local farm food, but that there was no efficient infrastructure to bring it into the city.
We saw an opportunity to connect our farmers in our region with communities like ours to make food, good food, accessible to all.
We've been farming for 30 years. Still, every year, it's still exciting to plant seeds, to watch things grow, and to wait for that first red tomato or that first ripe cantaloupe. I have been involved in some meetings on how to connect local farmers with institutions and schools. And it was a real logistical problem. You can't have 10 different people coming to your business or your institution with a couple boxes of this and a couple boxes of that. The Common Market is willing to work with the small farmers, the niche farmers, and help them find connections. So I see it as a win-win situation for everyone.
Through the economies of scale that the Common Market can reach, it can lower the retail cost of food to low-income households. Farmers themselves are low income and they don't want to sell their food cheap. So this is another reason why Common Market is important for the region.
The conventional food system involves many steps to get from producer to consumer, starting with food grown around the world. First, it's shipped by air or sea, warehoused, transported across the country, warehoused again, and distributed through a series of networks before it reaches the plates of the people who eat it.
It's a much more complex system, it's more expensive, the farmer gets less, and the food prices are higher than they should be.
In the Common Market, we're returning to an old-fashioned regional food system with a very short supply chain. Farmer, Common Market, buyer.
We are preparing 3,000 meals per day. Our philosophy is to offer healthier foods that taste really good. We first heard about Common Market back in 2007 when we decided that we really need to make some changes in the food that we're serving. We were very excited, especially because Common Market told us that they would use New Jersey farmers and that if there were, 2 people bringing broccoli that day, we would get the New Jersey broccoli, because supporting the local economy was a big part of our decision making. The first day was Brussels sprouts with pecans and tofu, corn and peas. It has been incredibly successful. When we started the healthier menu, we looked at the vegetable consumption before and the vegetable consumption after, and it went up 458%. It's opening people's eyes to how fresh food really can be and how delicious it can really be.
Clearly, there's a huge demand for local food. There's a premium on, buying local food, and this is a great market opportunity for a lot of farmers. But one of the challenges we keep hearing again and again is that there's these, fundamental distribution infrastructure and processing issues. You don't want to be buying from 6, 7, 8, 10 different farmers in order to satisfy, the variety of foods that you want to serve in your cafeteria or what have you. What a food hub can do is be able to be that one invoice that you can use. It lowers transaction costs. It actually creates kind of an efficient system for local food to get into these, higher demand markets.
We launched Common Market in 2008 with 1 box truck and a small walk-in cooler. In that first year, we sold a little over $100,000 of local farm food. This year, we're on track to sell over $1 million.
And we found a way to get local food, which has historically been preserved for the more affluent, into communities like ours in an affordable way.
Consumers are demanding this food, and Common Market is this crucial link between the consumers and the farmers.
There are many food hubs that have been developed that are primarily serving higher income, wealthier communities with good food. Nothing wrong with that. but it's a unique role that the common market has to play, connecting local agriculture, local sustainable products with those who are most vulnerable, who most need that kind of food, which are our lower income families and communities.
Ultimately, our goal is that good food is available to all people. On the other side, we want to see farmers in our community stay in farming so that this valuable farmland in our community is not paved over, converted into malls and housing development, so that farmers continue to play a vital role in our region.
What the common market and projects like it help us do is help us make a reconnection to the source of our food, literally the source of our sustenance in life.
It's vital for future generations to keep ground open and to keep it available for our food supply. We're always going to need to eat, and we need a place to grow it.
I would hope that 10 years from now, we will look back and we will see the common market as having been a model for the way our regional food infrastructure can get recreated, rebuilt.
Thank you. Watching that video brings me back to the time 10 years ago when we moved to our neighborhood. At that time, I was a second-year MBA student at Wharton studying finance and learning about wonderful markets that allocated resources perfectly so that everybody's needs were met. And it was a shock moving to Strawberry Mansion and finding a community that had been so utterly abandoned by markets to meet its most basic needs: decent housing, healthy food. In our journeys to bring healthy food into our community, we stumbled across a farm auction in Lancaster County, which is the main farm county next to Philadelphia. And we were so excited. We went in, we got a number so that we could bid on food, and we actually ended up getting a pickup truck full of apples to bring back to our neighborhood. And as we did the math to figure out the cost, our jaws dropped. We had paid the equivalent of $5 a case for a 40-pound case of apples that we were paying wholesale $25 in Philadelphia. How is a family farm supposed to sustain itself when it doesn't have access to fair markets? Particularly if the farmers are trying to use environmentally responsible growing practices.
So you have these two markets, or these two communities that are really struggling because of the disappearance of fair markets. And we started to ponder, was there this opportunity to really connect the needs of these two communities in a way that could be mutually beneficial? And as Tatiana points out, on one side you have multi-generational, sustainable family farms that are disappearing at alarming rates, largely because of a lack of access to fair and transparent markets. And on the other side, just an hour and a half down the road in communities like Strawberry Mansion, you have people who are suffering from diet-related disease at astounding rates, really because good food just doesn't exist. And so, the fundamental vision for the common market was, how can we connect these two communities? How can we really create relationships through trade of good food in a way that brings back health and wealth to our region? And in pursuit of this vision, actually at that point, Tatiana and I had been running a community-based organization for about 4 years. And that the sort of constant pursuit of funding support was exhausting, perhaps even more so than the after-school programs we were running with kids. And we thought if we're going to pursue this vision for a scaled regional intervention, we wanted it to be sustaining, self-sustaining from its operations. And while we didn't want to replicate the market dynamics that had ultimately come to fail our communities, we recognized that we needed to operate at some degree of appropriate scale so that we could have the impact on the growers we were trying to have, as well as the impact on the communities that we needed to have. And so, we needed to find really that appropriate scale that would allow this vision to stand on its own. So we started thinking about how do people in our communities get access to food? Where are they going for their food today? And it's been pretty well documented that many youth in neighborhoods like Strawberry Mansion get as much as 2/3 of their daily caloric intake from the schools. So we saw that the great opportunity was actually to connect the procurement power of community-based anchor institutions like schools, like hospitals, like colleges and universities, the very entities that were created to improve the quality of life for the communities that they serve. And but the bizarre thing was that for some reason these community-based institutions were serving some of the worst food that you could imagine.
And today, it's really nice to walk into some of the public urban schools that we work with and to see kids enjoying apples from local orchards. And they're not just apples to the kids. They're Granny Smiths or they're Stamen Winesaps. And everybody has a favorite variety. I talk a lot with the cafeteria managers, and they say that if they get apples from Washington State or New Zealand, the kids will take one bite and throw it in the trash. Because you've had these apples, they're bright red and shiny, and they look beautiful, but you bite into them, and there's no flavor at all, and they're mushy. And to give you an idea of the impact that working with institutions can have, just last year in Philadelphia with the public schools, we were able to reach 14,000 kids working with 26 schools. Multiplied that impact nationwide and consider that the USDA is spending $12 billion a year on food on the school lunch program.
So one of the things that for us I think is really fun about sharing this video is updating people on some of the metrics. Tatiana spoke to some of the impact we're beginning to have. And while this video is only a couple years old, and we were really, really proud to share that accomplishment of $1 million in sales that year. It's kind of our Austin Powers moment, right? This year alone, we'll move almost $2.5 million of locally sourced, sustainably grown farm food, and that's after posting growth of over 50% in the last year. And it's also always fun to share our story, about our model for a community-driven, real market or systems reform. An idea that began as an inquiry into how we could solve some of the disease disparity that existed in our community, and how that's evolved into a regional social enterprise that is connecting communities between Washington, D.C. and New York at this point. And so while we're still relatively small, our vision for change is grand. We see the potential in redirecting the procurement dollars of community anchor institutions to support viable, sustainable, transparent, and fair regional food systems. And while our work is really focused on democratizing access to good food, we're also trying to create new opportunities for farmers who grow food in an ecologically responsible manner. It's a tall order. We're also working to reform markets and trying to ensure that the markets no longer extract value from communities, but really that markets work to build and restore health and well-being in urban and rural communities. With that, we're really thankful to you all for listening and sharing in our story and in our work. So thank you.
And finally, we're going to bring up Paul Greenberg, who has written a lot about food that is very important here in New England: fish, seafood, the future of it. Sort of, he's talked about it being the last wild food that there is. And we just saw this moratorium on cod in New England. And one of the questions is, where is seafood going? Can we still eat it? Is there a possibility of saving it, of replenishing it, of eating it in a sustainable way? So I'll throw it to him, and then we'll take questions and talk about a bunch of issues together.
Hello. I'm on. Nice to be here today. Thank you so much. It's always great to get fish included in the larger question of food. I was having lunch with Michael Pollan earlier this summer, and I was looking at his book sales and my book sales, and I realized that I said, Michael, you know, I think the amount of books you sell is proportional to the amount of fish that people eat relative to the amount of meat that they eat. So 200 pounds of meat per person per year, about 15 pounds of seafood per person per year. So I'd like to raise all of that, but how can you raise that in a situation where we are always hearing about the death of the ocean, the death of sea life, the death of the marine world? Well, I wanted to bring to light today a kind of weird, very weird distortion, which I think a lot of Americans are not aware of, which is that, so this country controls more ocean than any country on Earth, 2.8 billion acres of ocean, more than twice what we have set aside for the production of land food. And yet, more than 85% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad. I was up at the, what's now the new Fulton Fish Market all the way up in the Bronx, and I was talking to this guy, Herb Slavin, who was one of the great grand pashas of the market. And I said, Herb, what do you think about the fact that more than 80% of our seafood is coming to us from abroad? Without missing a beat, he goes, who's abroad? So I realized that just right there, I mean, he's like the lady with all the fish. He wanted to know. So I realized that that was really a good point of discussion, and it sort of made the basis for my next book. So who is the broad? Well, let's take a look. So the broad is basically this, what I call the sort of Bermuda Triangle of American seafood consumption. Shrimp, salmon, tuna. Actually, tuna and salmon just traded places, so it's number 1 shrimp, number 2 salmon, number 3 tuna. So these choices are really weird, and they're really bad, generally speaking. So shrimp, for example. Wild shrimp, when you trawl for shrimp, use a very fine meshed net, because shrimp are, well, shrimpy. And so everything else in its path gets sucked in. So you can have bycatch, that is accidentally killed wildlife, at rates anywhere from 2 to 10 pounds per pound of wild shrimp caught. So that's great, shrimp. Shrimp are also extremely fuel inefficient. In a good scenario, it takes about 2,000 liters of gasoline or of diesel per metric ton of shrimp caught. So it's perhaps one of the most fuel inefficient species that you can have, and that's, of course, in the wild variant. Now, in the farm variant, and I should say 90% of the shrimp that we eat is imported. A lot of it is farmed, and a lot of it is coming to us from Southeast Asia. All of these shrimp are generally farmed in coastal areas where there should exist these things, which are mangrove forests. Mangrove forests are tremendously important to coastal stability, to biodiversity, all these kinds of things. But unfortunately, what we've done by promoting shrimp aquaculture throughout the world is turn regions like this into this. We've seen this throughout the world, millions of acres of mangrove forests lost, tremendous damage to marine ecosystems everywhere. Tuna was number 2, now it's number 3, but I'll put it in this order. Trouble with tuna. So tuna came to us largely through, actually as a result of war. The canning of tuna was a huge industry starting in World War II. And then after World War II, General Douglas MacArthur, when he was provisional governor of Japan, sanctioned the reconstruction of the Japanese offshore fleet, turned the pursuit of tuna into this great international business, so that now tuna is really coming to us from everywhere. So these areas are what are called regional fisheries management organizations, and each sector is responsible for highly migratory species in each part of the ocean. You can see right away this presents a huge problem, because many, many countries have rights to those tuna in those waters. How do you control that? How do you manage that? Well, some people say you can. I'm skeptical. Other problems with tuna. Huge issues around bycatch, sea turtles, sharks, all kinds of things that we don't want to catch get caught on pelagic longlines. Also, this great thing that you probably never heard of, but it's one of the main reasons you have tuna on your plate, is the FAD. Stands for Floating Aggregating Device. This thing are large plinths that they plant into the ocean. Because the ocean is kind of like a desert, anytime you put a structure in the middle of the ocean, it tends to attract marine life. And so all these fish are drawn to this area, depleting actually other areas so that they can come over to the floating aggregating device and get caught and be turned into your tuna. And then, of course, tuna are also extremely fuel inefficient, generally speaking. Again, up there around shrimp, 1,500 to 2,000 liters of fuel per metric ton caught. Salmon, another not such a great choice. So salmon, most of the time that we eat salmon, about 2/3 of the salmon that we Americans eat is farmed and imported, largely coming to us from Chile. Chile, in case you don't know, salmon are not native to the southern hemisphere. So we've actually introduced an invasive species into the southern hemisphere, which requires more pounds of fish to produce a pound of salmon. In the early days of salmon aquaculture, it could take as many as 6 pounds of wild fish to produce 1 pound of salmon. Now they claim they've gotten it down to 1.2, but that's when you're talking about reduced pellets that are reduced to 1.2 to get a 1.2 to 1 ratio. Actually, to make a herring into a pellet, it takes a lot of herring to make it into a pellet. So I would question those industry stats that are coming out. Now, of course, we've tried to go around this kind of problem. Here in lovely Massachusetts, you have the great company Aqua Bounty, which has developed a genetically engineered salmon. It involves an Atlantic salmon-based gene, base DNA, with a king salmon growth hormone, and then a regulator, a promoter protein from this fish, the ocean pout, which I like to point out is not kosher. So I spoke to the rabbis about it. They said the resulting fish will be kosher, but I just think it's an interesting point to bring up. So much lox, so much bagels. So, and this is all to basically make salmon more efficient and make it, get around that really bad equation. Well, except there's another really kooky equation, which is that we have a lot of wild salmon in this country. I mean, we used to have wild salmon in the Connecticut River and the Merrimack River and the rivers all over New England. We don't have them anymore, but we still produce 500 million odd pounds of salmon every single year, and 80% of it is exported. 80%. And in fact, 3 billion pounds of U.S. seafood is exported every year. And to make things triply strange, a certain portion of the wild salmon that we catch in Alaska gets frozen at sea, sent to China, defrosted, boned, refrozen, and sent back to us double frozen. I said this to Terry Gross on Fresh Air, and she said, "My mother always said not to double freeze fish." And she's right, Terry. So just a quick summary of the other 3 most consumed seafoods in America. Alaska pollock. Alaska pollock, 600 million pounds of it we export. We also make it into filet-o-fish sandwiches, and we make it into fake crab. Remember, Larry David broke up with his wife because during sex he couldn't stop talking about the difference between fake crab and real crab. Well, that's fake crab, Alaska pollock. 5th most consumed seafood in America, tilapia. Now, I love this graphic. You've got the Gloucester fisherman, and he's on his boat on the Georges Bank, and he's going to bring you back some tilapia. Well, tilapia, of course, is a tropical fish. It requires temperatures of 60 degrees or above. It's not caught anywhere near New England, but Americans are so divorced from their seafood supply that they think that the Gloucester fisherman is bringing that to their plate. And I should note, most of the tilapia coming to us is coming to us from China. 6th most consumed seafood in America is Pangasius catfish. These are Pangasius in a pond, and they're really shoved in tooth to jowl. When they run out of oxygen in their ponds, they can stick their little mouths above the surface of the water and take a breath of air. They're air breathing. So there it is, the face of the 6th most consumed seafood in America, the Pangasius catfish. That's where it is. So what do we do? How can we relocalize our seafood supply in a sustainable way? Well, I think one really obvious way, and we've seen it happen here in New England in a negative way, we were so obsessed with codfish in this country, or in this region, that we really hammered them to the exclusion of all the other things we could be eating. And if you look at it, there really are a tremendous amount of fish out there that we could eat. Tremendous amount. Sea robin, bluefish, winter flounder, summer flounder, sheep's head porgy, all these kinds of things that we could be eating, but which generally either get discarded or not even pursued. But in order to embrace those other species, we're going to need to embrace a new philosophy of buying seafood, which involves something akin to, I think, what our previous speaker was talking about, which is community-supported food, community-supported seafood. In the last 10 years, an array of what are called community-supported fisheries have appeared throughout the country. There are about 35 right now, and they're growing. And what they allow you to do is, at the beginning of a season, purchase a certain amount of pounds of seafood so that you are mitigating the risk of the fishermen, you're giving them some startup capital, and then eventually you're getting that fish in a very direct way, cutting out a lot of the middlemen, and making it a much better deal for everybody involved. What's really interesting is that there was a recent meta-analysis of the effects of community-supported fisheries, and what they found was that when you compared community-supported fisheries to supermarkets, you found a huge increase in the use of what are called hyperabundant species, species that are not overexploited, species that are not overfished or experiencing overfishing. That's the way to get these other fish onto your plate. Another thing that I would strongly suggest is to eat the bait. Now, a lot of people, that's sort of unappealing. Those of you who've been out in some of the boats, I would really want to eat that. But in fact, actually, it presents a really great thing. So herring, sardines, anchovies, which are generally often thought of as bait, are incredibly fuel efficient. So something like 40 liters of fuel needed to bring in a metric ton of herring versus 2,000 liters of fuel to bring in a metric ton of shrimp. So incredibly, incredibly fuel efficient. They're also extremely high in omega-3s. They also are extremely low in PCBs and mercury. So why aren't we eating them? It's very strange. And what are we doing with it actually here in New England, since we're here in New England? 80% of the New England herring catch goes into lobster traps. For those of you following the sort of kosher debate, that means good kosher fish used to bait trafe. But again, I won't go into that too much further. It's going to be in an op-ed soon, so you can read about it then. So, and then you look at it, lobster, again, I love lobster. I do eat lobster once or twice a year. It's often thought of as this environmentally sustainable thing, and it does have many good things going for it. It's in a trap. You're not hauling a net. You're not catching other things, but it's incredibly fuel inefficient. Again, it's up there with shrimp, around a couple thousand liters of fuel per metric ton of fish caught. Lastly, this is something that I think we really need to embrace, and we're really going to take a departure from kosher here, is to follow the filter feeders. So as some of the previous speakers were talking about, when you talk about agriculture, you're talking about an incredible influx of nitrogen into the environment, and particularly into the marine environment. And what nitrogen does is it causes the blooming of algae, which when it dies, sucks out oxygen as it's decomposed by bacteria. So this has created dead zones throughout our marine environment. There's something like 400 major dead zones throughout the world at this point. And nearest being probably here is Long Island Sound, where we're just seeing tremendous hypoxic situations. Well, if you embrace filter feeders, you go around that. This doesn't read, oh yeah, it does. So, a mussel can filter about 50 gallons of water per mussel per day. So imagine if we had a seafood system based on mussels, clams, oysters, all farmed, because they can filter a tremendous amount of water. They create tremendous habitat. And in fact, oyster farmers that I have spoken to here in New England have said that when you put in an oyster farm, the amount of resident seafood, of striped bass, of black sea bass, of all these kinds of things, doubles in a matter of years. It's just an incredible, incredible thing. Also, incredibly fuel efficient. Just incredibly fuel efficient. Using mussels as your primary form of protein compared to beef, for example, would be 50 times less the amount of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. So, imagine the McDonald's embraces the mussel burger. I don't think it's going to happen on my watch, but we spoke of our children earlier, perhaps on their watch. So, and if you don't like mussels and you want to stay kosher, you can go with kelp. Kelp, a tremendously, tremendously good mitigator of nitrogen influx, literally sucks it up, turns it into a great material that produces high omega-3s, iodine, all these essential nutrients that really, really could be a great way of feeding ourselves in the future. But it really requires us to fundamentally rethink what the seafood coming into our mouths, coming into our lives should be. So in summary, Michael Pollan has his great rules, his food rules. Was it eat food, not too much, mostly plants, right? Everyone remember that? Well, it's hard to boil it down with seafood, but I tried. So seafood rules. First of all, I don't mean to be just sort of a patriot here, but we're in America. Let's eat American seafood. I truly believe there is actually enough American seafood to support us all if we change our eating habits. So eat American seafood. A much broader variety of it than we currently do. Get away from that seafood Bermuda Triangle and embrace many, many different flavors and textures and origins that will really, I think, broaden our relationship with the marine environment. And finally, mostly farmed filter feeders. So those are my seafood rules. Take them to the seafood restaurant next time you go. And if they don't have any farm filter feeders, give them a piece of your mind. Thank you very much.
So let's bring back all the speakers and be thinking of your questions. We're going to go to them in a couple minutes. Paul, I will start with you. So, okay, you talked about farming, and you showed this sort of horrifying picture of all the mangrove forest being cut down. So when you go to your seafood counter, and I do this like all the time, I'm like, farmed? Well, that's good because they're not taking fish out of the ocean, and there's too many fish being taken out of the ocean. There's nothing left. Or, you know, the other option is you take wild, but then, you know, I mean, the downside of farmed is, are they feeding them pellets? Are they feeding them,
Right.
would it be brown salmon, but they're just giving them pellets to make it, you know, pink and look really nice?
What do I
When
do?
you get to the seafood counter, what's your sort of back and forth there?
Well, so there are certain always go-to things that I always get. I always get mussels. I always get actually sockeye salmon, wild sockeye salmon, because there's a huge fight going on right now called Pebble Mine, where they want to put the country's biggest copper mine atop the last remaining huge sockeye run in the world. So I do that to support that fishery. I almost always get U.S. farm-raised catfish, because I think that that is an excellent product. It's environmentally sound. But at the same time, what we're looking for is not necessarily farmed or wild. If it's wild, it should be under a good management regime, and that's why I stress U.S. origin seafood. There are a few other countries out there, Iceland, Norway, that are excellent managers of wild fish, Australia as well. If it's going to be farmed, you want to look at, again, country of origin is important, but you also want to look on, you know, farming types and farming certifications. There's a new thing called the Aquaculture Stewardship Council, which has just launched in the last few years, which is certifying individual farms. Whole Foods also does a pretty good job of controlling their supply chain and actually instituting standards. It's the standardless world that we need to avoid, and as a consumer, it's quite hard. I will acknowledge that. So, you know, you're not alone being confused at the seafood counter.
Haile and Tatiana, a follow-up question for you from what you talked about. When you bring, you know, food into a community that you know, generally doesn't have access to that kind of food, maybe hasn't seen it around in the local convenience stores or even supermarkets, do you see, even in the space of a few years, do you see changes in health? Or is that too soon? People are still, maybe people are eating apples, but they still have their other ways of eating too, and they haven't fully transitioned, or maybe they won't. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I would say that 2 years is probably not enough time
to turn around an entire community.
Right.
Really?
Yeah.
It's not, okay.
Imagine. It's also one of the challenges we face in measuring impacts. I know there's a lot of funders in the room. Evaluating the health impacts of our work is incredibly challenging, because we are not the only influence. You know, the food that we distribute is not the only food that you know, an individual is going to consume. But what we do see, though, is a change in attitudes, and really our approach in getting food into communities, I'm going to say, and outside of the institutional context, on the sort of grassroots level, is in actually partnering with community organizations and partnering with the types of organizations that are engaging children around growing food, around cooking food, really changing their relationships with food. So you do see increased uptake in the diversity of food that's coming into that community, and entirely different attitudes about what's acceptable to eat.
And I'd say that it's really the hardest part is that, or they talk about farm to fork, but it's that fork to mouth equation that's actually really difficult. And that it takes really strong partnerships with the community groups and with the schools and with parent groups to change that. And there's so much that needs to happen to kind of revive the kitchen culture. I mean, that you mentioned, even from your grandmother to your mother.
Right.
Not revive
Yeah.
the Jell-O culture.
Not the Jell-O.
Well, the funny thing was, that was like her big thing that she made, Jell-O. Sometimes I'd go to her house and she didn't really have any pots and pans, so I'd put something together and she'd say, "You are such a good cook." And I said, "Well, I was just microwaving takeout." And she was like, "But still." Anyway, you know, I think it's Michael Moss who's written a book about the idea of fast food being engineered in some ways to be addictive, to like hit that right point of sort of sugar and salt and fat and combine them in a way that keeps you coming back. Do you see that at all, that addictive quality? Is that evident to you on the ground or not necessarily?
Well, what I'm more aware of is just the pervasiveness of the unhealthy food in our community. I mean, people talk about food deserts, but it's actually, there is a lot of food. It's more like a food swamp. You know, there's no shortage of fast food and the Checkers and all of the kind of fast food and corner stores. And I think that in some ways it's the work that that's being done on the ground on community gardens and on cooking lessons for kids is trying to change those, almost change the sensors in the mind, right? So that an apple or broccoli that's grown in the garden has different, really different connotations.
Right, right. And tastes good.
It
It's
tastes
hard
good.
to compete with a cheeseburger. I mean, it's hard, yeah. John, one of the things I was thinking about when you were talking about the tremendous amount of food that's wasted, especially in the U.S., does that say to you, okay, we've got to take that food and spread it around better? Or does it say to you, we should grow less food because we just don't need this much? Like, what does that say to you, that all that we throw away 30, 40% of our food?
Well, I mean, I think it's on both ends of the supply chain. I mean, like in rich countries like the U.S., we're losing most of the food around the consumer again. And it's also linked to issues that are really germane, like food safety too. Like how many of you throw out stuff when the label says best by date, right? I do that, even though I kind of know better than I really shouldn't. But once you've had food poisoning once or twice, you just toss it out. And it wouldn't be great if if our biotechnology friends, instead of making GMOs we probably don't need, but made a label on the milk carton that turned red when the milk actually was bad. That would be a very useful use of technology. Or helping farmers in developing countries where there's still the same amount of food waste, but it's because the farmer couldn't get their crops to market and it just rotted in a warehouse or on the field. That's a double tragedy, the loss of the food and the income. And there are a lot of things we can do about food waste. We think about it as being, the virtue of me personally, or you personally, or all of us, in our refrigerators and our Tupperware. But you got to go to scale, kind of like you guys have done looking at schools and cafeterias and things. That's a really great leverage point. I used to work at the University of Minnesota, where our students forced the administration to take up sustainability standards to reduce our energy and water use a little bit every year. And one year they got to say, gosh, we got to reduce our energy use in the cafeterias. What do we do? Well, somebody said, well, let's stop giving people cafeteria trays. And so kids had to go in and hold their plates and this kind of thing. And that would save water in the washing and the energy for heating the water and all that stuff. It cut food waste in half. Right there. It was amazing. In a place that, we had 55,000 students. It's a pretty big place. And because students, that old proverb, my mom used to tell me my eyes were bigger than my stomach, right? Take an 18-year-old and throw them in a dorm where all you can eat, they're going to load up with all sorts of crap. And take away the tray, people don't do that. So there's a lot of things you can do that can kind of help scale the solutions to food waste, which reduces the consumption in the first place, so there's more on the supply end, but also just leaves less going to the landfill. It's just win-win-win.
Well, I've seen, and you've probably seen, 7th graders get a tray of food that's like sort of prepackaged for them, eat like this much and be like, okay, well, I want to go play dodgeball now, and then it's all done. So I want to take your questions. I think there are mics roving around, so if you have a question, raise your hand. I see a couple. There's one right here and one right here.
That's a great question, and it's a big part of the role that we play. We ourselves have Common Market has a very high level of food safety. We're third-party audited, and that's the only reason that institutions are willing to work with us. But then it's also important to us, in that certification, that all of our vendors be safe and be following safe practices. And because we're working with so many small farmers, they don't have the systems or the finances to have that same level, a lot of them to be GAP certified, which is the USDA standard for food safety. And so over the years, we've developed technical assistance and trainings for our farmers so that we know that we're spending time at their farm. We're actually doing an audit every year it's modeled on the USDA GAP training. And we're working actually to help them get the GAP certification. And the goal is, that's going to open more and more markets for them, because as the world changes, more and more buyers are requiring that gap. And we see that as another way that the market shuts out small farmers from these big opportunities.
And there's a question right back there. You got the microphone, yeah.
Hi, I'm Lynn Sherry. I'm the producer and director of the Young Voices for the Planet movie series, and one of them is called Longing for a Local Lunch, and we followed these kids in Massachusetts who were trying like anything to get local organic food into their school, and they were actually successful. And a legal conservation voter study showed that most kids, most adults got their information about the environment or sustainability from what their kids brought home from school. So we've been focusing on that. And I was wondering, you were talking about how do you change a community culture? And so I was wondering if you could share with us any stories about how you are getting this to the kids, and maybe the kids are bringing it home to their parents. Are there organizations that are working on those issues? And what kinds of successes have you found with once you get to the kids and sort of teach them whether they can change the community?
That's a great question, and I expect cooking might be a part of that. Like, if you have something now that you didn't have before, how do you prepare it?
Yeah, so really the precursor to the work we do at Common Market began with an organization in Strawberry Mansion that we founded called East Park Revitalization Alliance. And it works with kids to really open their minds around the possibilities of health and wellness and healthy decision making, using food and physical fitness as really sort of the way we exchange information with them. And so the programs run in the neighborhood. The kids are growing food in community gardens, in school-based gardens. Then they're marketing that food to their own community through farm stands that are set up with the incentive programs like a Double Up Food Bucks, which some of you may be familiar with in some of the low-income communities here in Boston. And so they're marketing this food that they're growing, and Common Market's then supplementing what can be grown in the community with what we aggregate from sustainable family farms in the region. So the kids are standing out there with a sort of an offering that's exciting to a variety of people. And then also these same kids are working with that same seasonally sourced product in their after-school programs, creating meals and feeding each other with this food. And so really involving them with different aspects of what looks like a more conventional value chain, but giving them ownership over it. And you're right. I think that they are the ones that are sort of leading within their households as it relates to household health. So.
Paul, let me bring that kind of question to you. That idea about information filtering down. I mean, obviously Japan, huge consumer of tuna. Shrimp is pervasive, and I didn't realize, I mean, you've been writing about this issue for a long time, but I didn't realize shrimp was as detrimental as you said. Is the information about how much carbon it takes, how detrimental it is in terms of depleting the tuna cycle, is that filtering down at all to like the eaters, to the governments?
People often say that fish are 25 years behind the land in terms of information flow and in terms of technology, and I think that's true. There are places like Seafood Watch, which the Monterey Bay Aquarium and the Safina Center run jointly, and you can get the app. But I find that is more helpful on a kind of species by species basis, just knowing, are these fish overfished? And they'll give a red, yellow, or green rating depending on where they stand. A lot of fishermen have problems with those ratings, I should say. NOAA Fish Watch, which is part of the National Marine Fisheries Service, has a site where you can find out if your fish is overfished or not. All that stuff about fuel efficiency and stuff like that is buried deep within the bowels of academia and required a serious trowel to dig out, and many back and forths and emails with Tasmania, actually, to get that stuff out. So I don't think we apply the same sort of carbon standards. But on the other hand, if you look at seafood overall, generally speaking, seafood is more carbon efficient than land food.
Interesting. Other questions?
Hi, Martha Little with America Abroad. John, this question is for you. You talked about solving some of the sustainability issues in food in Africa and places like that by just providing them with manure and water. But that's not a very sexy funding topic, is it?
How you ask?
Who doesn't want to fundraise?
I mean, it's a conundrum, I would think, to try to attract NGOs or donors to come in and just shovel manure to the locals. But it's what you say is very provocative, and I think it makes a lot of sense when you know anything about sub-Saharan Africa or any of these parts of those worlds. So what do you do in terms of selling the case, and have you had success in changing the norm among the funding community, among the NGO community? What does that discussion look like?
Oh, that's a really interesting question. Well, I think there are two schools of thought about that. You know, one, I mean, and they're both probably relevant here in that conversation. One is a more high-tech approach, which is, you know, perhaps the model of let's use more like American-style agricultural products, like maybe a genetically modified crop and more, you know, machine-based precision agriculture. That just doesn't, I mean, and regardless of what you think of the social and economic impacts that would have, which I think would be pretty tremendous and bad, it just physically, it doesn't make any sense. Those crops won't grow on the soils in sub-Saharan Africa right now because they're totally devoid of nutrients. You just have to build the soil first. You know, we're decades away from GMOs being very useful in Africa for the most part, I think. So I just don't think that makes a lot of sense from a scientific point of view, let alone a social point of view. The other, though, I guess, yeah, to make manure and water sexy again. You know, who would have thought?
Again, were they sexy
Oh
previously?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, of course we were. Where were you? You know, we're bringing manure back, baby. It's. I think it's actually focusing on maybe the social issues. I mean, think about it. You know, there are 2 billion people in the world under the age of 18. Half of them are girls. So there's 1 billion, you know, teenage girls in the world right now. 2 of them live in my house, and there's 650 million girls who live in households that earn under $2 a day. And most of those girls will never set foot in any kind of classroom because they're spending their entire day gathering water, gathering cooking fuel, gathering some kind of manure, or something like this, just totally drudgery, this unbelievably bad existence, which leads to, you know, lack of education, larger families, girls who will be having their children at 13, 14 years old and having large families with no rights. I mean, this is terrible. So to maybe lead with that, the kind of girl effect that we all talk about in these kind of communities is not just about food, it's also about the social condition of people there. And it's mostly smallholders, it's mostly women farmers, a lot of girls doing almost all of the labor. And so I think that's where the social justice side of the equation, plus the agricultural benefits and food security benefits, are bundled in ways that I hope funders would really, really understand and be very appreciative of the incredible impact that would have. But I would leverage the girl effect part of it probably first, because that's probably the most powerful lever, and everything would go with it.
One more question, either out here or there we go.
Thank you very much. Chris Shipley with MIT Technology Review. And first of all, thank you for a great discussion. And I appreciate that you've all approached it from a very systemic point of view, because there's not one singular thing that's creating some of these challenges. I did want to ask about Common Market, though, and it may be early days, but whether you have seen, as a result of bringing fresh produce, local produce into your community, changes in health outcomes.
Yeah, we touched on that a little bit. I don't know if there's, you know, any more you want to say about it, or if you've seen other things. But yeah, we did touch on that a bit, that change in the health outcome thing.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would say is that, yes, it has been documented that there has been a decline in obesity rates in youth, I'm going to say in Philadelphia broadly, and much of Philadelphia actually looks like Strawberry Mansion, unfortunately. And it's really the result of the work of a lot of organizations. So, you know, Common Market plays a small role in that. And at about 6.5 years old, we hope that our role continues to evolve.
Is money still a barrier to getting fresh food even when it's cheaper? I mean, do you still see people saying, I'm going to choose more calorie-dense food? And also, I mean, there's also the time issue. Time is money, too, especially if you, not if you work for $50,000 a year, but if you work hourly, then time is literally money. You could be spending another hour and then getting fast food that's already prepared for you.
Well, and it goes back to what you just said, that it is a systemic issue, and there's all of these components. I mean, it's not just about food and about personal choices, but it's about social equity, it's about economics, it's about really all of the systems that are putting pressure on our community, and thinking about, you know, any solution is going to have to address all of them, you know, to really make a change.